In the world of electric vehicles, Tesla has reigned supreme, but its days as top dog may be numbered. In China, the world's largest EV market, it's been losing ground to domestic automakers as a ruthless price war has inflamed an already competitive market.
If Tesla had not had price cuts of 20 to 30%, they probably would have actually had sales drop last year.
And there's one car maker in particular that has given Tesla a run for its money: Warren Buffett-backed BYD. The Chinese automaker logged 2.4 million new car insurance registrations in 2023, making it the top brand in China with a market share of 11%.
I don't think anywhere in the history of the automobile has any company enjoyed such explosive growth in such a short period of time.
BYD has grown into this powerhouse. You look at the monthly rankings, they're always at the top.
In 2023, BYD produced more than 3 million new energy vehicles, which include plug-in hybrids and battery electrics, surpassing. When it came to the US at the turn of the millennium, the hybrid car was considered a revolutionary step toward a less polluted future. It wasn't exactly exotic or luxe, but Hollywood celebrities loved its green image, while ordinary cash-strapped consumers adored its exceptional fuel economy at a time when gasoline prices were on their way to record highs. But since then, EVs have stolen the spotlight.
All electric with electric vehicles.
The Tesla Model Y becoming the best-selling vehicle in California.
While EVs stole the show, the company once lauded for bringing hybrids to the mainstream received extensive criticism from environmental groups for being slow to adopt EVs and for lobbying against tougher climate legislation. But EV sales have slowed in the US, going from selling in just 25 days at the beginning of 2023 to 72 days just over a year later. Meanwhile, hybrids are flying off lots, faster than even plain internal combustion cars, and winning awards. Hybrid sales grew 5 times faster than EVs in February 2024.
Automakers are finally reading the room. They're realizing that they still have to sell cars right now, not in the future, and this is what people want to buy.
Automakers, including some that had made bold commitments to go all electric, are now pulling back on EV manufacturing in favor of them. But hybrids aren't as effective as EVs at reducing greenhouse gases. Defenders say they are a solid short-term solution. Automakers, including some that had made bold commitments to go all electric, are now pulling back on EV manufacturing in favor of hybrids. EV sales in the US had a banner year in 2023. A record 1.2 million units were sold. Their market share is growing, and yet the oft-reported slowdown is real. Data shows sales growth is leveling off. One of the reasons legacy manufacturers are seeing an EV sales slowdown has been Tesla's aggressive price cuts throughout 2023. But legacy automakers are still selling lots of hybrids, especially standard ones without a plug.
You get a hybrid off of the truck at a dealership, a lot of times that vehicle already has a customer. So it's not even a point of it actually having to sell.
Comparing January 2023 and February 2024 data show that hybrids continue to sell much better than both internal combustion vehicles and EVs. Look no further than the company that brought the hybrid to the mainstream more than 2 decades ago, Toyota. Pro-EV and environmental groups say the world's largest automaker has been lobbying to slow the EV revolution it missed out on. Though it has experimented with battery electric vehicles before, the company has long argued that the bridge to full electrification will be a long one, and that most consumers aren't ready for fully electric vehicles. That said, it did in 2021 unveil plans to release 30 EV models by 2030, with an annual sales target of 3.5 million. In January 2023, Toyota faced its first shareholder proposal in 2 decades. Investors insisted the company do more to combat climate change and challenged the reappointment of Chairman and CEO Akio Toyoda. The proposal was defeated, and Toyoda kept his board seat, but he did step down from his role as CEO. As of early 2024, Toyota has only 2 EVs, and neither sell in large volumes. But in 2023, sales of its hybrids and plug-ins increased nearly 28% over the previous year. They make up about 30% of the Japanese behemoth's portfolio.
Nothing has really changed within the Toyota framework of product planning. Let me explain why. We have continued to say this very, very succinctly. A year ago, we were being mocked for it. Today, we were being congratulated for it. We're not swayed by either one.
Toyota's American rival and sometimes partner, Ford, has been selling EVs for longer and in larger volumes. Sales of its acclaimed Mustang Mach-E and the F-150 Lightning climbed nearly 18% in 2023 compared to the previous year. Hybrids still outpaced that, jumping by more than a quarter. Ford CEO Jim Farley said the automaker would postpone about $12 billion in planned EV investment and pull back on production of the electric F-150 pickup in favor of a hybrid version.
Success is a part of why everyone else maybe wants to jump back in, because they're seeing these brands have success with these vehicles, seeing so much demand. And not only are they selling fast, they're selling at MSRP in many cases.
While Toyota may have pioneered the mainstream hybrid, General Motors brought the plug-in hybrid to America in the form of the now discontinued Chevrolet Volt.
From an EV perspective, we also see this is our year to really execute and see growth there. So it's a strong performance in 23. I'm really proud of the team.
But in early 2024, the company said it will reintroduce plug-in hybrids to its North American lineup.
You look at their core buyer base, a lot of these people, infrastructure is not built out in places where they are living. If they have folks that are coming back to dealerships with their old General Motor brand vehicles, it's going to be a much easier sell to get these people into hybrids than it is to get them into EVs.
Automakers are under great pressure to meet continually tightening federal fuel economy standards. A single company's fleet has to hit an average target of 58 miles per gallon by 2032. That is 18% higher than the current rule of 49 miles by 2026. The EPA also issued standards in March 2024 that call for 35 to 56% of cars to be full EVs by 2032. With U.S. household costs rising across the board and gasoline prices at $3.50 per gallon on average, hybrid vehicles offer a sweet spot for many. ICE vehicles are losing market share, but EV sales are flattening. The market is running out of early adopters, and many say these vehicles aren't ready for the mainstream.
Basically, in the last 10 years, we've gone from 0% of the industry to 8%. So we're about a 10-year period of time. The government's regulations to say, okay, we've gone from 0 to 8% in 10 years, but now in the next 8 years, we're going to grow by 60%. Not grow by 60%, we're going to take that number from 8% to 67%. People are saying, wait, I don't know who's all going to buy those.
Right now, as we move towards mass market, those folks are a lot harder to sell to. They're a lot more price conscious, a lot more product conscious. They have a lot more questions in general. And I think that's going to really plague the EV adoption rate for quite some time. And that was always going to be the case.
On average, EVs were the most expensive powertrain you could buy in early 2024. Plug-in hybrids were almost as pricey. Standard hybrids were cheaper than everything, including ICE vehicles.
I think right now in this country, we are in an affordability crisis amongst many industries, but I think autos being a big one. Because if we look at how people have afforded vehicles in the past, it's been because of low interest rates. And now that is not the case. The average interest rate on a new vehicle loan is over 7%. Used, it's over 11%. So when we look at what we can afford, it probably is less than what we afforded in the past.
It's a tough pill to swallow to say I can buy a ICE vehicle or even a hybrid vehicle at, let's say, $700 a month and the BEV at $9,000 or $1,000. That's a significant bump.
EVs have strong selling points. They are simpler and cheaper to maintain, and the cost of charging is a lot less than refueling in parts of the country where gas prices are higher. But there are stubborn obstacles, still relatively long charging times, and a lack of public charging infrastructure.
But a lot of folks say, I just don't want the hassle of owning an EV. Like, my life is already complicated enough. I don't need to go learn a whole new system of doing things to just drive and go places that I want to go.
It's easy to put on a piece of paper, hey, I spent X amount of gas, I'm going to spend X amount of electricity. Great, I'm going to be ahead of the game in 18 months in terms of cost. But a convenience factor is priceless. This idea that I might run my family 4 states away for a vacation once a year, I don't want to take 3 days to get there. That convenience factor might completely take that consumer 100% out of the BEV market. And it can't be quantified.
83% of EV charging occurs at home. But JD Power data shows that 1 in 3 car shoppers don't have a home charger nor the ability to install one. The firm runs a mix of studies on electric vehicles, including a year-round public charging survey of 30,000 consumers in all 50 states and DC. The most common reason people decide not to buy an EV is the lack of public charging. EV owners say public charging issues are the least satisfying aspect of the ownership experience. Nearly 20% of the time drivers visit a public charger, they aren't able to charge. Most of the time, that is because chargers are failing or malfunctioning. But the number of times a station is unavailable or the wait is too long has doubled from 10% to 20% of failures in just 2 years. While EV adoption has hit some speed bumps, no one expects demand to fall or even remain flat forever. Globally, EV production is expected to double from 13 million in 2024 to 35 million in 2031, while hybrids are only expected to climb from 13 to 15 million. In the US, EVs will see staggering growth in the coming decade.
We're still very bullish on electric vehicles and where the market is going to go. You look at the investments that have been made in vehicle electrification by the manufacturers. I think that speaks loudly in terms of where the manufacturers think the market is going to go.
An important distinction: standard hybrids are really just more efficient gas cars, supplemented with a battery and electric motor that extends the vehicle's fuel economy. This is what the original Prius was and what many hybrids are today. Plug-in hybrids have a charging port, battery, and at least one electric motor. Some of them can, in theory, be run without gasoline at all, like an EV. The engine acts as a range extender. In others, the engine and electric motor work together.
With a plug-in hybrid or a hybrid, you get to largely avoid that public charging scenario. You're eliminating what is the worst aspect of owning an electric vehicle.
There has been a slight increase in the number of models available compared with standard hybrids since 2019. Still, though, they are the smallest category of cars in terms of market share, and they aren't especially cheap. On average, they cost nearly as much as an EV. They also don't offer a lot of the benefits of a full EV. You still have to get oil changes and maintain the internal combustion powertrain, and you have to buy gas. When driven on battery power alone, plug-in hybrids have just a fraction of the range found on a full EV.
In essence, what you're doing is you're taking 2 different product technologies, combining into one, but it's not serving either category all that well.
In other words, it might be the worst of both worlds. But it does provide the convenience of being able to rely on electric power for daily driving, but having the gas as backup when needed. The EPA electric range on the Prius Prime plug-in is 44 miles. The average American drives about 37 miles.
That's why you're seeing in the news from a lot of the competitors, you are seeing everyone starting to discuss it, but they're not discussing it as a bridge strategy. You're hearing them saying this is maybe the best valued strategy. I want to make sure we're clear. You're seeing a lot of momentum around plug-in because of what has been learned about the rejection of EV.
Another issue with plug-in hybrids is that they can be driven entirely on gasoline. A 2022 study from the International Council on Clean Transportation, a group that studies alternative powertrains, found that plug-ins might be driving on electric mode 26% to 56% less than one might assume from EPA labeling, and real-world fuel consumption may be 42% to 67% higher. The study did note that at the time the sample size was small and more data were needed.
Plug-in hybrids are great if you plug them in, as we talked about. Not everyone plugs them in, so the theoretical efficiency is higher than the practical one.
JD Power has found that plug-in hybrid owners are charging their vehicles pretty consistently, about 5 times a week on average, and they're using that electric range, about 70% of it per day. Despite concerns, some believe they may be the best available option for moving the needle closer to EVs.
You have to convince a consumer that a plug is not a disruptor to their life. And the way you do it is you introduce it to them in a little piece, not an all you can eat. concept.
Gil Tal, a professor at UC Davis, sees it somewhat differently. Plug-ins were originally conceived as a bridge technology, a temporary compromise that would obsolesce as EVs improved. While they certainly can serve that purpose, they may stick around a lot longer, at least for that last 20 or 30% of the market that is unable to make the full leap to battery technology. California, which plans to ban the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035, is still allowing 20% of all new cars sold after that point to be plug-in hybrids.
For a very short while, we were all thinking that a full electric BEV, battery electric vehicle, are going to get us to 100% or the full transition. I think we are learning to appreciate that it's going to be hard. So as long as we are thinking about 20% of the sales, 30% of the sales, we can go with full electric. But when we need to go to 50, 60, 70, closer to 80, it's starting to be.
Cars dominate American life. The daily commutes, road trips, errands, families ferrying the kids around. You name it.
Wow, look at this! Wow, this is tough!
On the more than 4 million miles of road across the United States, 70% of Americans drive themselves to work. Only 3.5% take public transportation. The common explanation is this all happened because Americans just love cars and driving. The open road.
There it is.
Almost too good to believe.
My careful study of this history over a couple of decades now persuades me that the historical record shows that car domination was not the popular preference, was not voted for through democratic processes. It wasn't even the result, as a lot of people will try to claim, of free enterprise just doing its thing.
So it is economical, but I don't care. I don't drive a car to save gasoline. I drive for fun.
Policy has been a driver of shifting what's convenient away from public transit and walking on the one hand to driving on the other.
That has downsides. It's expensive, dangerous, and, say critics, makes cities a lot less livable. There are, of course, some health costs as well. But some attempts to push back on car dominance, such as congestion pricing, transit funding, bike lanes, or pushes for walkable cities, have stoked controversy. CNBC talked with some scholars and looked at numbers to see how America really got so hooked on cars. There are about 283 million registered vehicles for a US population of about 341 million. That means more than 80% of Americans could technically own a car. This graph right here shows urban mobility in Europe versus the US. Depending on the city, you can see how the population is moving around by public transport, walking, skating or cycling, or driving. In Europe, there's a pretty fair balance between those who are active, take public transport, and drive. On average, about 30 to 50% drive, and the rest is divided between active commuting and public transport, but definitely leaning towards active. In North America, on the other hand, it is generally 70 to 90% by car. Through the years, Americans have mythologized or romanticized the open road, but many roads in the US often actually look a lot more like this. On average, the time Americans spend in traffic is equal to an extra full week of work per year. That's not commuting time, that's just time lost to congestion. In cities like New York and Chicago, it's more than twice that. It's also not cheap to own a car. Insurance premiums, repair costs, and vehicle prices are all near all-time highs. In 2024, Americans, on average, spent more than $12,000 to own and operate a new car. While cars are in many ways safer than they have ever been, they still can and do injure and kill people. Vehicle fatalities started rising again in the 2010s after years of declines. The federal government has called it a national crisis. Those numbers have since fallen a bit, but are still relatively high. Between 2010 and 2023, pedestrian deaths skyrocketed too.
The USA has the worst traffic safety record of any high-income country in the world, and also, almost uniquely among high-income countries, the trends have not been improving over the last 10 to 20 years.
America is hardly alone. Evidence suggests going car crazy is in part a byproduct of prosperity. It's not a perfect comparison, but nearly all American households have access to a car, while only about 55% of Americans have access to public transit. When Americans think of charmingly dense cities with walkable streets, a robust bicycling culture, and great public transit, they often think of Europe.
And of course, all those things are true, but there has been a change. Everybody went crazy for the car once their country got rich enough. And in that sense, we have good company.
There is an important difference, though.
Around the turn of the century, a lot of European countries built out their public transit networks a lot more aggressively and started doing things like implementing congestion pricing, which of course has just been rolled out in one city in the US.
A frequently cited reason for this major distinction is the vast size of the United States and the relatively low density of a lot of American communities. The US is more than double the size of the EU in landmass, even without Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories, but the EU has about 100 million more people.
I've never owned a car in New York City where I used to live, but I've also never taken the subway in Iowa. There is no subway in Iowa. Population density doesn't support it. It just doesn't make sense.
But even comparing a highly populated American city with a European one, like New York versus London and Paris, the numbers are vastly different.
In the early 1900s,
many American cities were built around public transit and walking, but later became car-centric. There were multiple reasons for this, but a big one was policies favoring cars. These policies were supported by an alliance of different kinds of automotive groups: car clubs, car dealers, manufacturers, sometimes even taxicab and local delivery companies. The list goes on. That group called itself Motordom.
One of the conclusions they reached is that cities like Boston and Chicago and so on were cities where you didn't need a car. And within Motordom, they said this is a bad thing because people aren't buying cars even though they could afford them. They had a term for this. They called it submerged demand. To them, a great way to deal with submerged demand was to promote a road building policy that they were already behind for reasons of moving and selling cars, but that would also promote suburbanization.
In the early 20th century, cars were far more strictly regulated than they are today, but soon the legal regime flipped in their favor.
At first, this strategy was largely directed at the urban fringe, where suburbanization was most possible. But by the 1950s, it was also invading the city itself in an attempt, unfathomably destructive attempt, to make old, dense cities places where you could drive and where you could own a car and keep a car.
A self-reinforcing cycle took shape. Investments in cars, such as road building projects, led to further investments in cars.
We often hear the Interstate Highway System and the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which is the basis of it, are often sort of taken as the starting point of modern American car dependency. I think that is a much too late of a dating. In fact, one of the things that made it possible to have this enormous public works project was that by 1956, Motordom had already won most of the necessary victories over things like engineering standards, traffic codes, safety education, and so on. And once they'd won those battles, the Interstate Highway Project actually seemed like a natural next step almost.
A 1977 U.S. Supreme Court decision called driving a virtual necessity, because long before then, it had become one.
This is perfectly understandable. I'm not even faulting them because this is just good business.
In 2024 alone, the automotive sector spent about $64 million lobbying in the U.S., second only to the air travel industry. There is still a legal regime in place that intentionally or otherwise favors cars and makes it hard to build communities around other forms of transportation. Schill says we subsidize cars, trucks, and SUVs in two main ways: legally and fiscally. Two examples of legal subsidies: land use restrictions and traffic laws. First, land use. There are a number of laws around how people are allowed to use land. For example, nearly all American cities require buildings or structures to have some kind of attached parking. That is changing, but it's still really common.
It's just crazy to me that, big dense cities are requiring huge amounts of parking.
Some laws may not intend to promote driving, but they effectively do. Many communities around the country have zoning laws that restrict home building to single-family dwellings rather than more dense structures like duplexes or apartments. Many of these laws came into effect during the automobile age. Large shares of the buildings already standing in some of America's cities would be illegal to build today. These laws really require communities to spread out, which makes them difficult to comfortably traverse on foot. Lower density also makes it tougher to justify public transit. Traffic laws also favor cars. Speeding is a major contributor to motor vehicle deaths, as much as drunk driving even, but Schill writes that they are under-enforced and are enforced arbitrarily, among other things. Jaywalking laws only exist because of cars. Secondly are the fiscal subsidies. Critics call
that wouldn't have happened. Now, are there negative externalities of that? Of course. Have we managed those effectively? Of course not.
There also was the allure of cheaper and often higher quality housing out in the suburbs.
When you look at America today, where you see high transit ridership, New York, San Francisco, Boston, you have sort of lower income people who use transit and then very high income people who use transit. There's sort of like a bimodal split. And so if you think about Manhattan, all the fanciest, richest neighborhoods have subways. You can see how if you're really in that middle class, you can't afford that. And then maybe you don't want to live far out on the subway in Queens or Brooklyn or the Bronx or whatever. So then what's left for you, right? You have suburban America.
So while cars did benefit from policy support, people also liked and could afford to live in places where cars were essentially necessary.
American cities in 1900 were not pleasant places, so one can understand the desire to suburbanize and move out. I think context today is very different.
Cars won't vanish from U.S. roads anytime soon.
I would expect the use of cars to intensify.
Over the last 10 to 15 years, especially since the pandemic, a growing share of Americans have chosen suburbs and exurbs over cities.
Where you really need a car for daily life. There's really no indication that as an overall trend that is reversing. I think in this country, taking steps to push people away from cars is doomed to fail and is undesirable as a matter of individual liberty.
For those jobs where driving makes the most sense, we should permit driving, although we may have to charge people for the public costs of accommodating that driving, like for the road. But wherever anything else works, we want to accommodate that.
A slice of the population would prefer to live in smaller apartments and denser places if it means taking fewer car trips, walking and biking more, and taking public transit or cabs and rideshare. A lot of Americans say they like walking and biking more than driving, and some polls in the past have suggested a majority supports more money for public transit.
I think overall we'll see more reliance on cars, but I do think we'll see growth of this additional option that has been, to some extent, suppressed by legal constraints, by law.
A plethora of cities around the country have rolled back their parking requirements and loosened zoning laws.
We want to promote walkability. We want to permit cycling. We want to take advantage of the fact that now, thanks to electric bikes, cycling is something that is more practical on more topographies for a much broader range of people if we would only accommodate that very low intensity demand that's much more affordable to accommodate than driving.
Some measures may prove more popular than they seem at first. New York enacted a congestion pricing plan in January 2025 to reduce traffic in the city, but it came after some intense legal battles.
In the literature, among people who study cities, there's this debate over whether policy should try to push people away from cars with a stick or whether it's better to use carrots. And I think this is kind of a false dichotomy, and congestion pricing shows that, right? On the surface, it's a stick. If you're driving during peak hours into the congestion zone, you have to pay the fee. But it's also a carrot because you can drive much more easily and quickly for that price. And as a consequence, that creates a stream of revenue that can be used to strengthen public transit.
But strengthening the case for other transit options, especially investments in public transit, requires making them cost-effective. NYU's Transit Costs Project has shown that the U.S. pays a lot more for public transportation than many peer countries. The first phase of the 2nd Avenue subway in New York City cost 10 times the amount of comparable systems in Italy, Sweden, and Turkey.
People can interpret some of our work as being anti-transit. It's not the case, of course. But what you see in the US is just very little output for time and money.
The U.S. could reduce costs several ways, such as by adopting practices from low-cost countries, standardizing designs for stations, not overbuilding, and holding agencies accountable for budgets. But public transit also has to compete in terms of time. It takes about twice as long as it does to travel by car. That also doesn't have to be the case. Caltrain, a commuter rail line in the San Francisco Bay Area, electrified its trains, which sped up trips. The group also doubled the frequency of service.
That oftentimes puts you in, striking distance of driving. And then it's like, okay, I get those 10 minutes back. That's awesome. I'll take it.
Ridership jumped 17% overall and 38% on weekends in its first month of service. Tesla's production of 1.84 million cars.
BYD is so much ahead of Tesla in China, it's almost ridiculous.
Early on, Elon Musk was dismissive of BYD. Chinese car makers weren't taken seriously by their rivals.
It used to be that foreign brands had the majority of the market share in China. Now it's Chinese brands. And when you look at the vehicles that these Chinese OEMs and Chinese brands are putting on the market, they are some very good vehicles.
Now, they're a serious threat as they not only dominate the Chinese market, but have grand ambitions of expanding globally. In 2023, BYD's exports grew 334% to 242,765 vehicles across 70 countries.
About 40% of the EV market in China is owned by BYD, and they're just starting to export globally to places like Australia, Japan, Europe, and potentially very soon the United States.
CLSA has some predictions that by 2026, BYD will enter the top 5 automakers in the world, and this year they may reach the top 10.
BYD, short for Build Your Dreams, was originally started as a battery company in 1995 by Wang Chuanfu in Shenzhen, China.
It started out in the 90s as a manufacturer of batteries for cell phones. And for the first 10 years, low cost was their magic formula. We're going to undercut all the competition.
After building a successful business supplying customers such as Motorola and Nokia, it decided to enter the auto business. It bought Xi'an Qinchuan Automobile and launched its first internal combustion car in 2005, the F3. In 2008, it launched the F3DM, a plug-in hybrid EV.
I remember driving in and riding the earliest BYDs. They were called the F3 and the F1, inspired by Formula One racing, which is almost comical because their cars were these sort of mediocre commuter cars that were powered by Mitsubishi engine.
In 2010, it unveiled its first fully electric vehicle, the E6.
It was progress, but it wasn't perfection still. Taxis would buy the electric vehicle because they got incentives to do so, but very few private individuals had any appetite for BYD cars.
The company's auto division didn't see much growth through the 2010s.
Sales increased, but only gradually. Profits on those sales were mediocre. In fact, in 2018 and 2019, BYD's sales year on year were declining. Up until very recently, it was on the fence whether or not it was going to make it as a car company.
However, it managed to turn things around.
In 2019, I saw some of their new products called the Tang and the Han, designed by German designers, world-class designers. And the first time you see, ooh, these are actually good-looking cars. There's potential here.
In 2022, the company stopped production of its ICE vehicles, focusing on building battery electric and plug-in hybrids.
The majority of their cars are in the mass market, so that helps with volume. And they've also not completely shifted into pure electric vehicle at once.
BYD is backed by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and considered entering the US market in 2008 when Buffett acquired 10% of the company.
Warren Buffett himself said, "I'm betting on the man. I don't understand the technology. I'm not sure about the China market. will EVs take off or not, but this guy is 1 in 10 million. So he recognized something special in Wang Chongfu, and it's with that he gave his blessing to an investment, about $250 million.
A lot of the reason why he invested was because of the battery business, more so than the vehicle business. And that has grown dramatically along with their vehicle sales.
BYD's stock is up over 1,400% since Buffett first invested. Berkshire Hathaway did pare down its stake in the company, selling more than 60% of its shares since last summer.
Why would he draw down? So one is geopolitics. As he's mentioned with Taiwan, he said, I don't like TSMC because of the location. Second thing going on, Tesla ignited a price war about 1 year ago at the end of 2022. And that price war has been ferocious, so much so that most EV makers in China are losing money today. There's only Tesla, BYD, and a couple others that are actually able to make a profit.
At the core of BYD's winning strategy, price. Many of its vehicles undercut the competition.
In Munich just a few months ago, they launched the Seagull, priced at, get this, $11,500. Very competitive in the segment of $35,000 and under.
Its expertise in batteries, typically the most expensive part of an EV, has helped here as well.
BYD designs, develops, engineers its own batteries at scale. So not only they have the capability and the capacity for their own products, but they're also supplying batteries globally with plans to build battery plants all over the world.
They are one of the top companies in the world building lithium iron phosphate batteries in particular. They cost about 30 to 40% less per kilowatt hour to manufacture. And LFP batteries are also extremely durable. They last a long time.
As a leader in battery technology, it actually supplies batteries to other car makers, like Tesla, Toyota, and Kia. In 2020, it launched the Blade, a lithium iron phosphate battery that the company touted as a breakthrough in high energy density with high levels of safety.
By many accounts, BYD's Blade battery is best in class globally right now. What they've done essentially is to maximize the energy density, and this is attractive to everyone in the industry.
BYD is not just in the passenger car market, it makes trucks, buses, and other vehicles as well. The company actually builds and sells electric buses in the US at a factory in Lancaster, California.
They have had a big business in the commercial fleet vehicles, including buses in the US, Latin America.
But its passenger cars are what account for the majority of its sales. The company offers several models at a variety of price points. The Dynasty series includes the Kin, with a price starting around $14,000, to vehicles priced all the way up to the Tang on the high end, starting around $34,000.
The vehicle that really put BYD on the map for the new energy segment is the Han. It's a sedan that they launched in July 2020, and this car just took off.
The Ocean series appeals to younger consumers and features the Seagull, BYD's smallest car, with a starting price around $10,000, up to the Seal, a sedan that starts around $22,000.
When they released the Dolphin and Seal models, one of the things that I was told was, well, we have many different colors. It's supposed to appeal more to young families and especially women.
BYD has also introduced vehicles under luxury sub-brands Denza, Yangwang, and Fengcheng Bao. Denza, a joint venture with Mercedes-Benz created in 2010, introduced a few EVs for the Chinese market before undergoing a restructuring in 2021. Mercedes has since reduced its share to 10%, but BYD has continued to develop new vehicles, starting with the D9, a luxury minivan, the N7, a direct competitor to the Tesla Model Y, and the N8, a larger SUV. Yangwang, created in 2023, targets the high-end segment with a supercar, the U9, and a luxury SUV, the U8. Details of its next car, the U7, recently revealed it will have quad electric motors with a range around 500 miles. Fangcheng Bao, also created in 2023, launched its first vehicle, the Bao 5, in November last year.
Yangwang is definitely BYD's effort to enter that really luxury segment of the market. I mean, the cars are either extremely gigantic or they're in the sports car category, which is very different from BYD's other cars.
Most automakers at some point in their history try to create halo vehicles that will reflect well on the rest of the brand and create an image for the brand. And BYD is no different. It's a sign of their growing confidence. Say, look, we can do what Ferrari or Lamborghini or Porsche can do just as well, if not better.
Being the leading electric car maker in China, BYD has set its sights on bringing its cars to other markets.
Starting around 2018, 2019, market slowed and margins started to drop, and all Chinese automakers said, uh-oh, if we stay still in our domestic market, we're going to drown in overcapacity and hyper competition, and we're already seeing that play out.
It's already a major player in Southeast Asia, where it has 43% market share in EVs, and is currently the top-selling EV maker in Thailand, Brazil, Colombia, and Israel.
In Thailand, they were basically non-existent in the market a year ago, and just in the last few months, they've become the top-selling car brand. And I believe they also have targets to double their sales in the Philippines and Singapore this year.
Last year, the company started selling in Mexico and is looking to enter Japan.
They just are launching the Dolphin in Mexico now, increasingly growing into other markets in South America where Tesla doesn't really have as much of a presence right now.
BYD is building up its presence in Europe. Last year, it sold 13,000 vehicles there and now has its own massive cargo ship capable of carrying 7,000 vehicles. It recently delivered 3,000 cars to Germany in its first voyage.
It's pretty in line with BYD's strategy overall to make sure they have as much as possible in-house. With the ship, that just gives BYD extreme control over costs.
It's safe to say that their number one priority right now overseas is Europe, because in Europe there's legislation to go electric, there's people with money to buy electric cars, there's decent charging infrastructure.
The company has said it will open its first European plant in Hungary, but the Chinese automaker is facing obstacles abroad.
The EU in the last couple months has announced they're going to be investigating subsidies that went into the production of Chinese-made electric vehicles.
The EU Commission saying, hey, we don't believe your costs. We think that you're probably dumping or over-subsidizing your products, and that's why you're so competitive here.
In China, new energy vehicles have received substantial support from the government. Rhodium Group estimates that BYD received approximately $4.3 billion in state support between 2015 and 2020. But the biggest question of all, will BYD try to sell its cars in the US?
They're definitely preparing for the US market, waiting for the right timing. US and Europe promise a profitable market. They have to enter and compete and win here to thrive globally.
Currently, tariffs make it expensive, with made-in-China EVs hit with a 25% tax on top of the 2.5% tariff imposed on imported cars.
A lot of these companies and the investors in these companies, which in some cases includes various levels of government in China, there seems to be more of a tolerance for, at least for the time being, taking losses in order to grow market share.
It recently announced it will build a factory in Mexico, possibly to gain a foothold in the North American market.
Few people know it, but China's the #1 supplier of cars to Mexico already. And the next natural step will be for them to build manufacturing plants in Mexico. They're already looking at sites. They're well advanced in their research, and will ship our vehicles up through the border into the U.S., starting probably their expectations after 2025.
What is the possibility of the Chinese getting closer and closer to our market?
Within the next 5 or 6 years, you will see several automakers likely begin final assembly in Mexico. Why is that important? Because of NAFTA. It basically eliminates that tariff. People will say Americans won't buy Chinese. You know what? You ask somebody, do you want to pay $9,000 for an SUV, or do you want to pay $19,000 or $20,000 for an SUV? No contest. And that's what we found with everybody we've talked to down here.
U.S. lawmakers have warned Chinese automakers could flood the market and be a threat to domestic automakers.
People in DC definitely have an eye on that, and you can bet that they're talking to the Mexican authorities. The risk is real for the U.S. at a time when UAW has just negotiated all-time record high wages and perks.
In Australia, Chinese automakers aren't restricted by tariffs, and BYD has grown considerably there. After entering the country in 2022, it now has 14% of the EV market. Tesla leads with a 53% share, but has been selling there since 2014.
The Chinese car companies are the most competitive car companies in the world. I think they will have significant success outside of China, depending on what kind of tariffs or trade barriers are established. Frankly, I think if there are not trade barriers established, they will pretty much demolish most other car companies in the world. They're extremely good.
But with China becoming such an automotive powerhouse, it may be hard to keep its ambitions at bay.
Chinese automakers have learned very quickly how to produce really appealing vehicles. They're more affordable, and they're arguably, in many respects, better vehicles. The rest of the industry has reason to be scared.
China today has capacity to deliver half of the world's demand for vehicles. Half. And given their strength and their low cost and their incredible